For 3 straight weeks, every night after 9, a young CEO couldn't explain what she saw in his eyes. A low-level employee. A single father. He always left at the same hour exhausted, but carrying something resolute that stopped her cold every time. Nobody noticed him. Nobody thought to ask. Then one night, she followed. Quietly, through the rain. Just to know. 17 minutes later, she stood frozen at a glass window face to face with a truth she hadn't been looking for. What she found didn't just change how she saw him. It destroyed everything she thought she knew about herself. What would you do if a single truth made you regret every judgment you had ever placed on someone? She had not become CEO of Meridian Systems at 29 by doubting herself. Isabella Grant operated on a philosophy that was simple to state and genuinely difficult to live. Outcomes were the only honest language. Show up, deliver, repeat. Sentiment was a distraction. Potential was a polite word for unproven. She had built her company's culture in her own image, lean, fast, relentlessly accountable, and she was proud of it, in the uncomplicated way that people are proud of things they have poured themselves into without reservation. There was no gap between who Isabella was at 7 in the morning and who she was at 9 at night. She was the same person at both ends of the working day. Direct, perceptive, slightly impatient with ambiguity, and entirely committed to the idea that the best measure of a person was what they produced when nobody was grading them on effort or intent. Meridian was a mid-sized technology company in the infrastructure software space, the kind of product that kept hospital networks and logistics platforms and municipal utility systems running without ever producing a headline. Unglamorous. Essential. Isabella had acquired the company at 26 after a larger firm's hostile bid collapsed under regulatory scrutiny, and the original founders needed a fast and clean exit. She had restructured the entire operation in 8 months, made the difficult cuts with directness and without theater, retained the people who understood the product at its roots, and rebuilt the management layer almost completely. Revenue grew 38% in the year that followed. The board treated her with the particular combination of admiration and relief reserved for people who make complicated things look efficient. Her directors respected her with the specific quality of respect that contains, just below its surface, a thin and sensible layer of caution. She was not unkind. She was precise, and precision, in a person who holds authority, has a temperature. It runs slightly cold. Her mornings were identical. She arrived at 7, always before the office had reached its full population of people and sound, and she walked the floor during those early minutes the way a doctor walks a ward, looking, noting, reading the aggregate condition of the room. She made mental observations about who was present and who was still absent, about the quality of attention at each workstation, about the subtle signs that distinguished people who were moving toward something from people who were simply in motion. She had what she called, privately, a feel for momentum, the ability to read the difference between genuine effort and performed effort, between someone who was grinding through difficulty toward a real destination and someone who had learned the outward signs of grinding and was using them as cover. She had built her career on this ability. She was confident in it. She ran weekly departmental performance reviews that most of her directors considered excessive and that she considered an irreducible minimum. She maintained a private spreadsheet, color-coded and updated every Friday before she left the office, that tracked each department's output against quarterly projections. Row by row, color by color, the picture assembled itself. Green for on track, yellow for adequate, red for requiring attention. She would have insisted, if anyone had asked, that the spreadsheet tracked work product rather than workers. That insistence became harder to sustain the longer you looked at it. Sebastian had occupied a pale yellow row in that spreadsheet for 3 consecutive quarters. He was a Level 2 IT support technician, the category of role that sustains the daily operational reality of an organization through interventions so routine and unglamorous that they are noticed only in their absence. Printer configurations, network permission changes, internal software deployments, credential resets, help desk tickets from users who had forgotten passwords or couldn't get their monitors to talk to the doc. The work was not interesting. It was necessary. Sebastian did it with a competence that registered in his metrics as adequate. Ticket resolution within expected windows, no critical failures attributable to his watch, internal user satisfaction scores that hovered comfortably in the middle of the acceptable range. He had been with Meridian for 4 years, surviving 2 rounds of restructuring that had eliminated 30% of the staff. He knew the older infrastructure layers the way a long-term tenant knows the layout of an apartment building, not from the architectural plans, but from years of lived contact. That knowledge was occasionally useful. It was never formally recognized. Isabella had contemplated a performance improvement conversation with Sebastian twice in the previous year. Both times, practical considerations had held her back. His familiarity with the legacy systems was an invisible asset, invisible in her metrics, but real in its occasional necessity. She had noted this to herself as a reason to keep him on for now, which was the most she had thought about him as a person. As a now, a provisional retention pending a clearer signal. She was not unkind. She had simply not looked at him carefully enough to see anything more complicated than his output score. There was a moment, several months before she started watching him leave, that she should have thought about more carefully. A quarterly debrief with the IT director, going through the performance summaries, and the director had mentioned Sebastian in passing, mentioned that he had quietly resolved an issue with the backup server cluster that 3 other engineers had been unable to isolate for 2 weeks, who had resolved it without fanfare, filed a brief note in the incident log, and moved on to the next ticket. The director had said it almost apologetically, as if acknowledging that the contribution didn't fit the expected profile. Isabella had noted it and moved on. She had not revised his row in the spreadsheet. She had not revised it because a single instance of quiet competence was, in her framework, exactly that. A single instance. Patterns were what mattered. Patterns were what told you something real. She had not considered that the pattern she was looking for might be visible only in the hours she wasn't watching. He was not unpleasant to manage. He was not a source of friction or complaint. He did not involve himself in the political currents of the department. He did not seek visibility or angle for recognition. He did not volunteer opinions in meetings beyond the technical question directly in front of him. His colleagues found him reliable without finding him remarkable. There was a junior developer on the 2nd floor who had once described him to a coworker as the guy who fixes things, but never seems like he actually cares about fixing them, and somehow the phrase had landed in Isabella's mind and stayed there, because it matched something she had been unable to articulate about him. It wasn't accurate, she understood that. Eventually, but it was the story the surface of things told. And she had accepted it without looking deeper. What she had begun tracking with increasing attention over those 3 weeks was his clock. Sebastian Cole left every single evening by 8:45. Not 9, not 8:50, 8:45. With a precision that began to feel, the more she noticed it, like something deliberate, a discipline applied to departure, the same way a surgeon applies discipline to a procedure. She had established an unwritten expectation at Meridian. The people who were serious about advancement demonstrated that seriousness through hours. The ones who stayed late signaled something. The ones who left with the same rhythm every night signaled something else. She had attached a meaning to Sebastian's departures. She had not examined whether the meaning fit. The night that forced the question arrived in early October, when a server malfunction began cascading at 7:15 in the evening. A corrupted configuration file had propagated through one of the network management layers, a deeply embedded failure, the kind that lived in the system's oldest architectural logic, that most of the engineering staff would have needed a full morning to locate and a full afternoon to resolve. Isabella had been on a board call when the alert started coming through. She stepped out of the conference room to find her IT director already on 2 phones at once, 3 junior technicians staring at their monitors with the specific expression of people confronting a problem they recognize as being above them, and the floor carrying the particular tension of an unresolved crisis. Then she saw Sebastian Cole. He was already seated, already inside the system, moving through the diagnostic layers with a quiet efficiency that seemed immune to the atmosphere around it, unhurried, methodical, tracking the failure backward from its visible symptoms toward its buried source. He was not performing. He was not narrating his process for anyone's benefit. He was simply solving the problem, the way you solve a problem when you understand it from the inside. Systematically, without drama. Noting the secondary instabilities he caught along the way with the same neutral attention he gave the primary failure. Within 41 minutes, the cascade was contained. 2 additional vulnerabilities had been identified and documented. Sebastian filed a 3-sentence incident, report clear, complete, actionable. Then he closed his workstation with the same quiet economy of movement he used every night, gathered his jacket from the back of his chair, and left. It was 8:42. Isabella stood in the doorway of the server room and watched him cross the floor toward the elevator. He did not look back. He did not glance toward her office to see whether she had noticed. He walked with the same weight in his eyes that he always walked with, tired and resolute, and pointed at something she still could not see. She stood there for a while after the elevator doors closed, turning the question over in her mind, until she understood that she was going to keep turning it over until she answered it. She followed him 3 days later, on a Thursday evening. The city was wet, not heavy rain, but the fine, persistent autumn mist that turns streetlights into gold blooms and the pavement into a surface that reflects everything. She left the parking structure 2 minutes after his car cleared the gate and kept 2 lengths of distance between them through the downtown grid, telling herself, in the crisp and businesslike internal voice she used for difficult decisions, that this was information she needed and she had a right to it. The reasoning was thin. She knew it was thin. She kept going. She watched him stop at a red light and thought about what she was doing. A CEO. Following a technician through a wet city on a Thursday night because she couldn't answer a question about his eyes. She had made considerably stranger decisions than this, she told herself, and most of them had turned out to be correct. The argument did not fully convince her. She followed him anyway, 4 blocks from the office. Sebastian's car turned onto a side street she didn't recognize, a quieter stretch of the city, lined with low commercial buildings and a few small businesses, the particular stillness of a neighborhood that has never been interesting enough to attract the attention of people who remake neighborhoods. He parked in front of a building with a single warm-lit window and no visible exterior signage, a hand-lettered placard inside the glass that she was too far away to read. He crossed the sidewalk and went through the door without pausing, the unhesitating motion of someone for whom this place had long since become simply part of the ordinary geography of his days. She sat in her car with the heater running for almost 2 full minutes. Her instincts, trained and well exercised and responsible for a great deal of her success, ran through their customary inventory of explanations. A second job. A personal arrangement. Something undisclosed that might constitute a policy concern. She had no evidence. She had nothing but a question and a window. She got out of the car and went in. The lobby was narrow. 2 upholstered chairs, a coat rack, a reception desk behind a sliding glass partition. A woman in her late 50s, reading something on a tablet. The woman looked up at Isabella with the unhurried patience of someone accustomed to receiving strangers into a space that handles private things. On the wall behind her, a framed mission statement about communication and connection, and the long, patient work of learning to make yourself understood. Beside it, a poster of illustrated hands arranged in precise configurations. Below the poster, a small institutional placard that identified the center by name and by its service. Speech and language therapy. Isabella stood still for a moment. The interpretation she had been quietly building around Sebastian Cole shifted and settled into a shape she hadn't anticipated. She did not speak to the receptionist. She walked to the observation window at the end of the short hallway, the one that looked into the primary therapy room, and she looked through the glass. And she stood there, and she stopped being the CEO of anything for a while. Sebastian was seated on a low chair built for small children, his tall frame folded into it with a deliberate and careful awkwardness that was not awkward at all. He had positioned himself at eye level, closed the distance in every way he could. Across from him, seated cross-legged on a small padded therapy mat, was a girl of about 6 years old. She had Sebastian's dark eyes and something of his quality of attention, a watchfulness that was not passive but deeply concentrated, the look of someone paying the most careful and costly kind of attention she knew how to pay. She was watching his hands the way you watch something that you are trying to understand completely, not just observe. Sebastian was making a gesture, patient and deliberate, repeated with slight and careful variations each time, his face composed and calm, and entirely oriented toward her. His lips moved occasionally, not in speech exactly, but in the visible formation of sound, the physical scaffolding of phonemes that a child working to connect motor action to language can follow with her eyes when sound alone is insufficient. This was not conversation. This was construction. He was building something, piece by piece, with the patient consistency of a person who has accepted that the timeline does not belong to him and who has stopped arguing with that fact. The girl whose name was Luna, though Isabella would not learn this until later, did not respond immediately. She watched. She processed. Her small hands rested in her lap, and one of them lifted tentatively, her fingers beginning to approximate the shape he had been making. Sebastian went completely still. He did not repeat the gesture. He did not lean in or prompt her with a look. He simply stopped moving and held the space open. The particular quality of waiting that belongs only to people who have understood, through long experience, that certain things can be invited only by openness, not by pressure. Luna made the gesture back. It was incomplete. One element was missing. The motion trailed off at its conclusion rather than finishing cleanly, and it was entirely unmistakable. She looked up at her father's face when she was done, and Sebastian Cole, who had maintained professional composure through a 41-minute server cascade without so much as a visible exhale, came completely undone. Not dramatically, not in the way that collapse looks from outside. His face changed. Very slightly, very briefly, the composed exterior giving way to something underneath that was entirely undefended, the expression of a man who has been hoping for something for a very long time with no certainty it would ever come, and who has just, in this small and imperfect moment, been answered. His eyes brightened. He held completely still. He did not make the moment larger than it was. He looked at his daughter with the particular quality of seeing reserved for things that are irreplaceable and have somehow survived. 3 seconds. Then he gently composed himself and made the gesture again, slightly modified, indicating the next element. Luna watched his hands. The lesson continued. What happened in that room in the next 20 minutes was not dramatic. Sebastian repeated gestures. Luna watched. Sometimes she responded. Sometimes she processed in silence. Sometimes she tried something, and it didn't come out right. And Sebastian simply waited and tried again from a slightly different angle. There was no frustration in the room on his side. Isabella watched for it and did not find it. There was no weariness, no clock watching, no sense that this was an obligation he was managing rather than something he was genuinely present for. He was there, entirely. Not for Meridian, not for any metric or outcome she had ever thought to measure. For the small girl across from him, who was learning that she had a voice. Isabella stood at that window for 11 minutes. She counted them later, because they needed to be counted. She drove home without turning on the radio. She parked in the underground garage and sat in the dark for a long time with her hands in her lap, doing nothing she could have named or explained. She was not having a revelation. She was sitting with the specific, uncomfortable weight of having been wrong about someone in a way that had consequences that she had enforced in some of her decisions without knowing they were consequences. The distinction between not knowing and not looking was one she was going to have to sit with for a while. She went to Human Resources the following morning with a pretext that was thin but sufficient. A routine file audit. She pulled Sebastian's personnel file and read it with the same methodical attention she gave financial diagnostics. Sebastian Cole, 33 years old, 4 years with Meridian, level 2 IT support. His salary sat in the lower third of his pay band, a number she now understood was supporting not just his own life but regular speech therapy for a 6-year-old girl, and a cost that the company's health insurance covered only partially. She had approved a benefits restructuring 18 months ago. She had reviewed a 3-page executive summary of the changes. She had not read the full appendix detailing the coverage modifications. She had not thought about what those modifications would mean to a single father in the IT department. She hadn't thought about it because she hadn't thought about him. There was more. Sebastian had held a second job weekend shifts at a data recovery firm across the city for 14 consecutive months. He had filed the required secondary employment disclosure. It had been processed and archived without escalation because the secondary employment was legal, involved no conflict of interest, and fell below the threshold that required manager notification. He had never applied for a promotion, despite the system log showing he had opened and read every internal advancement posting in his department for 2 years. He had submitted no requests for schedule accommodation, pay review, or caregiving leave. He had attended every training session the company required. He had done everything the job asked of him, quietly and completely, and had arranged everything else around it with a discipline the job had never been designed to recognize. She set the file down. She sat with it for a moment. Then she thought about something else. She had been inside the performance management system for this company for 4 years. She had approved the benefits restructuring. She had approved the pay band ceilings. She had designed, at least in part, the framework that made Sebastian's row in her spreadsheet pale yellow for 3 consecutive quarters. The framework that measured what he did during business hours and was entirely blind to what he was doing at 8:45 at night in a small room across town, building something without any of the company's resources, on his own time, with his own money, for his own reason. She opened her laptop and looked at her spreadsheet. Pale yellow. Adequate. She had looked at this row dozens of times and seen the color. She had never once asked what was behind it. The shame of that was not a comfortable thing. She let it be uncomfortable. She understood, by this point in her professional life, that the instinct toward fast corrective action was often a way of escaping discomfort rather than learning from it, and that decisions made to escape discomfort tended to be decisions made for the wrong reasons. She stayed with the discomfort for 3 days. She rehearsed what she knew about Sebastian and examined each piece of it through the corrected lens: his professional silence, which she had read as passivity; the calculated conservation of energy by someone running a finite and carefully managed supply; his departures at 8:45, which she had catalogued as disengagement, a hard and necessary boundary, protecting something more important than anything the office could have kept him for; his quiet efficiency, which she had labeled adequate. Not the signature of someone who didn't care, but of someone for whom the job needed to function cleanly so that the rest of his life could continue to function at all. She thought about the specific cruelty of the way she had once described this in a review meeting to her IT director, choosing the word uninspired. She had used that word about a man who was building a language by hand for a child who had never had one. The word sat with her like a stone. She didn't try to move it. She thought she deserved to feel its weight for a while. She had spent months looking at him and seeing only the surface. The surface, she understood now, was entirely deceiving. She started with adjustments that had genuine operational rationale. The IT department's flexible scheduling guidelines were revised: staggered start and end windows, earlier departures permitted on high-resolution days, and the revision was applied to all 12 members of the team because it was actually a sound operational policy, and she made sure its benefits were real for all 12 before she signed off on it. She formalized Sebastian's system access permissions, bringing his recorded authorization level into alignment with his actual capability. A correction that was functionally a formality, but was important as a formality because it meant that his contributions would now be accurately visible in the records that shaped how he was perceived. She initiated a benefits committee review of the developmental therapy coverage in the company's health plan, presenting it as a long overdue equity audit, which was accurate. The previous reduction had created disparities affecting multiple employees, and structural errors required structural corrections, not individual exceptions. Not assistance dressed as policy, actual repair. She did not tell Sebastian about any of this. She was not ready. Her reluctance was at least partly self-protective, and she was honest with herself about that. But she did what she could from the outside, and she kept the harder conversation ahead of her like an appointment she had made with herself and intended to keep. October brought the conversation's occasion at 10 past midnight, when her IT director called with a flat and careful voice. The core network management system had failed. A fundamental failure in the legacy infrastructure layer, the original architecture, undocumented, navigated around for 3 years by engineers who understood its outputs but not its logic. The cascade was developing. Hospital networks, logistics systems. By morning, significant client impact. 2 hours on the line with the vendor. No resolution. The problem lived in the old layer, and there was one person who knew the old layer. Sebastian answered on the second ring. No sleep in his voice. He said he would be there in 20 minutes, and arrived in 18, moving through the entrance, with the specific quality of someone who has made peace with the fact that certain problems require the full attention of a full night, and who is entirely prepared to give both. He sat down and worked. The same quality of attention she had now seen twice, once through glass in a therapy room, and once in the server bay complete, methodical, unhurried. He tracked the primary failure and two developing secondary instabilities simultaneously, documenting as he went with a precision that made his process reproducible. The other engineers in the room oriented toward him by natural gravitational logic. Competence in a crisis draws people the way certainty draws people in uncertainty. And Sebastian had both. He did not perform for the room. He solved for the system. At 3:47 in the morning, the cascade stopped. Client network stabilized. Sebastian filed 7 pages of technical documentation, the most thorough architectural map of the legacy system the company had ever possessed, and then looked up at Isabella, who had been sitting 10 feet away through most of the previous 5 hours. She had watched him the way she had watched him through the window, not assessing, simply seeing. "Good work," she said. "It needed documenting anyway," he replied. "The old layer won't survive another major patch cycle." "That's a conversation the company needs to have." "It will," she said. "Because of you." Something in her tone made him pause for a moment reading it, uncertain whether he was reading it correctly. Then he nodded and walked out into the early morning quiet. She scheduled a meeting with no title and no agenda description, a calendar notation that simply read, "Conversation, 1 hour." When Sebastian came in and sat down, she left the desk clear between them. She had drafted the opening lines several times and discarded every version that was evasive or transactional, or primarily about protecting herself from the awkwardness of the admission. She settled for the version that was most directly true. "I have managed this company for 4 years under a specific set of assumptions about what commitment looks like," she said. "I applied those assumptions to you. They were the wrong assumptions, and the wrong lens. And I want you to know that I understand that now. I have been wrong about what I was seeing." Sebastian was quiet in the complete way he was always quiet, entirely present, entirely receiving. "I'm offering you a promotion. Senior Infrastructure Architect. Your knowledge of the legacy systems has been functioning as an invisible structural asset for years. It should not be invisible." He looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Take time to think." "I don't need to," he said. And, after a brief pause, "Thank you." She had planned to close the meeting there. Something held her in her chair. "How is your daughter?" she asked. The shift in his expression was brief and almost imperceptible. A flash of the instinctive guard of a private person unexpectedly asked about something private, followed almost immediately by a softening that surprised her. Not surprise at the question. Something older and quieter, the specific release of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time, and who finds, unexpectedly, a small amount of that weight acknowledged. "She's making progress," he said. "Real progress." "I'm glad," said Isabella. She meant it as simply as it was said. She had already submitted the benefits committee revision. Luna's therapy sessions would now be covered at 80%, not as an exception, not as a special arrangement, but as part of a corrected policy applied uniformly across the company. The previous coverage had been inadequate for 11 employees. The correction addressed all 11. She had made sure of that before she signed anything, because the only version of this correction that she could live with was the version that was actually just. Sebastian moved into the senior architect role with the same unhurried competence he had brought to every role before it. He documented the legacy infrastructure with a thoroughness that became, within 2 quarters, the department's most valuable technical resource. He mentored junior engineers the way people mentor best, when they remember precisely what it felt like to work without guidance, not with condescension, but with the particular patience of someone who has been alone in a hard problem and knows the value of company. He still left at 8:45 most evenings. On the nights when a problem was interesting enough to hold him past that, he stayed. On the nights when there was nothing urgent, he sometimes left at 8:30. He had stopped thinking about whether anyone was tracking the time. He had never truly cared about being tracked. He cared about the thing his time was going toward, and that thing continued to exist and to require him, and to return his investment with something he could not have put into a performance review, but that shaped every hour of his life. Luna said her first complete word, not an approximation, not a partial effort, but a real and unmistakable and entire word on a Saturday morning in November, in the small room at the therapy center. She looked at her father for a long moment after she said it. Her expression was one of deep, particular satisfaction. The look of someone who has been working at something privately for a very long time and has finally delivered it to the one person it was meant for. The word was Papa. Sebastian pressed both hands over his face. He breathed. He held completely still, for a long time. He told no one at work. The moment was whole within the room where it had happened, and within the two people it had belonged to, and it did not need to be carried outside that room to be real. Luna had said the word. He had heard it. Everything after that was just the rest of his life, continuing. Isabella would learn of it weeks later, through a coincidence she hadn't arranged. She walked back to the office in the November afternoon, and stood at her window and thought about measurement for a long time, about the instruments she had spent her career refining, and about the things those instruments could not detect, about the entire dimension of human life that existed below and beside and entirely outside the metrics she had built her professional self around. She thought about Sebastian leaving every night at 8:45, for years, carrying something she had never thought to ask about. She thought about 14 months of weekend shifts and therapy appointments paid for with whatever remained after the necessary things. She thought about a man who had organized his entire life around a single, unwavering priority, and who had never once asked the company that employed him to account for it or accommodate it. He had simply managed it, quietly and completely, in the hours the company didn't own. She revised the spreadsheet that winter. She removed the color coding system entirely. She replaced it with a format that tracked what she knew and left space, deliberately, for what she might not know yet. The space was not large. It was important. There is a particular kind of life that does not announce itself. That carries its most significant weight without performance. That does its hardest work in rooms no one has thought to check on. Builds its most important things in the hours that appear on no timesheet. Measures its progress not in metrics, but in the patient accumulation of small moments that mean everything to the people they belong to and are invisible to everyone else. The people living those lives are not asking to be found. They are simply present in a frequency that most management frameworks are not built to receive. Isabella Grant spent the rest of her career trying to build frameworks that could receive more. She did not always succeed. The habits of precise quantitative thinking are durable, and the tendency to reduce a person to their measurable output is built into most of the structures that organizations run on. But she kept the question active and kept it honest. What is happening in the lives of the people in this building that I don't know about? She could not know all of it. It was not hers to know. But the question changed what she noticed. It changed what she thought to offer and what she thought to protect. And it changed the temperature of the room in ways that mattered to the people working in it. Sebastian Cole did not become a different person. He became a person correctly seen, whose capabilities were formally recognized, whose knowledge was properly recorded, whose time was understood to have a direction that deserved respect. He moved through his work the way he had always moved through it. Steadily, without theater, toward the thing that needed doing. Luna kept progressing. By spring she had phrases. By summer she had sentences. By fall she had questions, the kind that arrived in rapid succession and required real answers. The questions of a child who has discovered that the world will engage with her if she engages with it first. Her father answered every one of them. He would answer them for the rest of his life, he supposed, without impatience, without tiring, because each question she asked him was a small proof of something they had built together in that lamplit room, the bridge between her interior life and the world outside it, constructed piece by patient piece on two small chairs, in a language assembled from scratch, on ordinary evenings after work, when no one was watching. Some truths do not arrive as revelations. They arrive as corrections, quiet, necessary, slightly overdue. The truth that changed Isabella Grant was not complicated. It was simply invisible, until the night she chose to look for it. 17 minutes. The time it takes to drive 4 blocks in light traffic. The time it takes to stand at a window in the rain and understand that the story you were telling about someone was not the story they were living. The time it takes to have everything you were certain about quietly, permanently, rearranged. Sometimes what changes everything is not a large decision. It is a small truth you almost walked past.